There's a lot that we could touch on the impact of sea level rise on both drinking water and wastewater systems, international law and global movements in the context of rights of nature, ecocide, rights of future generations.
Who can afford to adapt? Whose responsibility is it to pay? Who is most vulnerable? What are the other levels of vulnerability that those who are vulnerable to climate change face? And what responsibility do we have overall in thinking through this? And what are the levers of change?
Are we regulating the wrong things, or that we're not really able to quantify in some measure, right, or in some metric that we could agree, the actual harm that a particular thing is doing in a particular place?
What do we do about drinking water supplies? And what's happening in the drought is the agricultural wells are doing two things. One is they're sinking the water table down to where the smaller wells serving disadvantaged communities go dry. And they're also sucking contaminated shallow groundwater into the deep aquifers.
My God, if we could give legal personhood and eternal life to a corporation, we ought to be able to do something about the living world that supports us.
Good evening and welcome. This evening, ClassACT HR 73 is honored to present ClassACT Forum, Climate Change and Water Crises, Drought, Flood, Contamination, and What We Can Do About Them. I'm Marion Dry, co-chair of ClassACT HR 73. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Aram Sattar, Program Director of the Sustainable Water Management Program at Tufts University. She has a doctorate in juridical sciences from Harvard, and she focuses her studies on climate change as it disrupts water availability, as well as on the structures societies need to design to adapt to growing environmental stresses. Jeff A. Baer, who is president of HR&A Advisors, is a leader in climate resilience and community revitalization. He is the former vice president of the Water Institute, and post-Katrina, he was called back to Louisiana to lead the governor's long-term community recovery planning process. Kelsey Leonard, assistant professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, is a water scientist, legal scholar, policy expert, writer, enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. Her research focuses on indigenous water justice and its climactic, territorial, and governance underpinnings. She's a graduate of Harvard and a member of the Harvard Alumni Association's Board of Directors. Andy Sawyer, who is a classmate of ours in HR 73, is Assistant Chief Counsel of the California State Water Resources Control Board, where he manages the activities of the Office of the Chief Counsel around the State Water Board's water rights and drinking water programs. William Mumma is a professor emeritus of international environmental policy and founding director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School, and currently co-director of the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University. As lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Reports, he and his team shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for their work on climate. Bill has had an emergency and he may join us later in the program, so that's why I'm providing his information now, and we certainly hope that all goes well, but he may not join us too. So all of these people are doing extraordinary things and have been for quite a while. So please look at their fuller bios on our website. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Aram.
Thank you so much, Marion. And thank you really to ClassACT for putting together, I mean, wow, we're the 14th. So you guys have been doing so much work, and we are honored that you would host such a conversation. So I really want to just say that, up front. As I believe everybody will, who's joining us will realize, we have assembled an amazing group of people here for you today. And one of the things that I believe all of us share in common is an interest in sharing what we know widely in education, whether that is through our practice or formal teaching. So please remain in touch. And I'm speaking for everybody here. I believe everyone will want to hear from you as to what we can potentially do. And that obviously flags the calls to action that there will be later. So just, keep that in mind. I will keep what I want to say in terms of an overview very brief, because I really want us to have a rich conversation, give our panelists time, as well as give a lot of time for engagement to all of you. But let me say a couple of things that do come to mind. I got sort of obsessed, and I know that Marion has known this for years, with water a very long time ago, to the extent that I did my dissertation in water sharing and water governance. One of the things that I think I can safely say with all the years that I've spent trying to understand water as either a resource, which is more common in Western societies, or with different relationships that we have or other people have with them, some of which I believe we'll talk to you about also today, is that it is vital. And we know that one of the things that global people who make water policy, as well as the World Bank, not that that should, sort of guide us, but what it does tell us is that climate change will affect and actually act through the water cycle. So that's how most of us feel what is happening around us. And if you look at some of the wordings of what we put together for you, right, a focus on droughts, flood, contamination, and a whole host of things to do with water, where climate change is impacting the water cycle. So I just want us to have that in mind, that it is very unlikely that any part of our lives is untouched by water. And I hope that in today's conversation, you will get a huge sort of dive into the different aspects of what that means. And so, that's like the goal of this conversation. But please, let's make sure that we all do keep talking. And I hope that we do inspire you, to sort of, for significant action, because we think that's going to be critical. So just having given that sort of brief overview, what I do want to do is I want to today, as you've heard from Marion, we're going to turn to our first panelist, especially because Bill may not be able to join us, but we will see how it goes. So Jeff, if I may turn to you with the first question, and given all of your experience on sort of working on extreme disasters and reconstruction after it in urban settings, I really wanted you to reflect on essentially, I suppose, what this extreme vulnerability means and effects mean on the infrastructure that we currently have. As I believe everybody is mindful, there were massive floods in Germany, underground subways were being flooded in China, in New York City, subway system, things were impacted. So really, how ready are we to tackle this extreme change that is essentially manifesting now? And if I may just quickly also ask you to touch upon, is it going to be the case that only the rich will be able to adapt? So what are sort of like, what are the things that we really need to be mindful of to be equitable?
Thanks, Aram, and thanks, ClassACT. Happy to be here, actually, particularly with this question. And I'm sitting here in New York, and in a few hours, we're expecting a torrential downpour that potentially will last for the next couple of days, yet another in the series that we've seen. And it's a very good question around getting ready, or if we're ready. And I think, from my perspective, I don't think we are ready. I think we're in the process and at the beginning stages of even having a conversation about what ready means. And I want to just sort of focus us on what I think, and others could argue with me on this, but 3 sort of concepts around what getting ready is going to mean, particularly for urbanized communities and societies around the world. Some of this will resonate mostly in a Western context. Some of it may already resonate in other contexts. But The first is sort of cultural. The second is behavioral, and the third is infrastructural. And by cultural, I mean, what we need to understand is that given what's taken place and what has accelerated, we're in a new reality where we have to embrace living with water in a very different way than we have, particularly in the sort of the era of engineering over the past 80 years. It's going to be very different. We have to embrace living with water. We have to understand that what is happening to us is not going to stop. And we have to sort of culturally appreciate water in a different way than we have in the past 80 years, particularly in cities, urbanized cities around the world, where our goal has been to transform even seeing water into pushing it aside, not understanding where it is, building over it for centuries. And in a way, what is happening in many places is the exhumation of water into the urban environment in a way that I think was not predicted by most people, because we've gone through these series of pushing it away. That has a lot to do with past floods in history and the technological advances that we've made that really are not going to stand the test of time, and we're starting to show it now. The second that builds on from cultural is behavioral. So once we understand our relationship with water has to change, we must change our own behavior. And that behavior means, as I was linking to before, we can no longer just drain it away, and we have to start transforming our policies and regulations so that that change sticks. And so when you look to examples around the world, or even here in the United States, in the Pacific Northwest, in places in Europe, particularly the Netherlands, after 1952, in France over the past decade with several floods across France, but particularly for those who watch television or are very active in media, the very close calls to flooding in Paris, all of these things have to change. And what we're starting to see is changing in behavior, changes of behavior that result in changes in policy and regulation other places, including here in the US, but that has to also accelerate. And then the third is infrastructural. So once you have sort of the cultural fabric of society understanding the place that water has in our society, the behavior starts to change around our policies and regulations and the way we develop. The third is infrastructural, which is to transform the way that we have been building for this quote unquote threat for the past 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and transforming it into something different that we're living with and we see it as a resource and a value, and also understanding how we can live with it to mitigate a lot of the suffering that we've seen over time. Thinking about nature-based solutions, integrated infrastructure solutions, and reimagine and pull back the layers, particularly in the urban fabric that has blocked the water away from the cities. That's extremely important. There are examples of this across the world. Of course, the Netherlands, where we see a lot of these examples. In Paris, there's a project called the Oasis Project that has started to retrofit schoolyards to retain water and become park space in a bid to try to pull back some of the fabric in Paris. Paris is extraordinarily dense. There isn't a lot of places for water to go, but using these examples to try to understand what we can do is very important in that sort of infrastructural change and thinking about how we act. Within each of these are costs and questions of who should bear those costs, to get to your second point, Aram. And these are actually the types of questions that will be taking place. We'll hear more about it over the coming weeks at COP26, and was a lot of part of the conversation in Paris before. The rich have historically always been able to adapt. There are examples time and time again of building and rebuilding. That is not something that I think we should be necessarily concerned about, because there are many people who have the resources to do so. And frankly, people have chosen to live in risky environments over millennia in an understanding that things might happen and they might have to rebuild and dedicate resources to that. The problem is the poor and even middle class have less resources to do so. And particularly with the middle class, property ownership in threatened communities that have been very much so because our culture and behavior and infrastructure have been allowed to be built over the past 60, 70, 80 years in this country, in particular, and other cities around the world, those investments are threatened, which could wipe out swaths of middle class wealth, as well as the suffering that we see a lot of by poor people who really have no choice whatsoever. I mean, we've seen this very recently with Hurricane Ida, with vast swaths of suburban New Jersey flooded, communities without flood insurance because they never thought they had to, and total wipeouts of middle class housing stock, and the component of wealth creation that is and has been for some time the backbone of the middle class of this country and other Western countries, and other countries that are developing, who are looking at the American model of real estate and ownership. The poor are working poor here in New York City. We saw just weeks ago in Hurricane Ida, living in basement apartments because that's what was affordable, died in flooding that happened, flash flooding that happened, because that was the cheapest place that they could find to live. Substandard apartments that shouldn't have been, frankly, the development shouldn't have taken place there anyway in the beginning. And you see this around the world. So the question is that I don't think we can resolve, Aram, and is a part of what I think about all the time, is who pays for this? Who pays for the ability to adapt? Who got us into this mess? And who's going to get us out of this mess? What is the responsibility of government? Government extended resources to build most of these risky communities, either through the infrastructure or through mortgages or both. And so one of the big issues that we will have to deal with in the coming years, and as part of the conversation now, particularly with the National Flood Insurance Program, is whose responsibility it is. It's good for the government to say you shouldn't be building here anymore, but frankly, the government exacerbated the issues by financing the development of most of these communities, and in places with poor communities here in New York City or Houston or many other places where public housing was cited specifically in riskier locations because it was cheaper land. There is a certain level of responsibility that government has to have as a part of this. So that's a much longer conversation. And I know there are other questions later, but I think it's questions that we all have to really think about and resolve. Is we did not get this far without some sort of assistance and support. And how do we, particularly those who are most threatened and most vulnerable, how do they begin to see the light out of this situation as well? Because they do not have the resources that others have to just pick up and move.
Thanks, Jeff. And maybe that'll be one of the calls to action that people can really think about, right? How do you think about these hard problems? Andy, if I may, please turn to you, which is sort of the other end of the spectrum, right? Which is of long-term drought. As we know, the Colorado River is in a 2-year drought, which has basically brought leak meat to its lowest level since 1930. And if I could get you to concentrate on what kinds of changes to laws, norms, institutions, perhaps as well as infrastructure, that will be needed to adapt to this new normal, which is the drought. So, you know, the water rights system, and that, if you could address.
Thank you. Yes, California is in an unprecedented drought, which started before we could finish our evaluation of how well we responded to the previous unprecedented drought. What we are seeing is that climate change is exacerbating problems that we had not adequately addressed before. This graphic is intended to show just how variable the level of precipitation is in California. The lighter sort of, pink colors show areas of the country with relatively little variation in precipitation, with the darker colors, the green, the violet, the black, showing the areas with the greatest variation from year to year. And you can see California and the arid West have much more variability from year to year than the rest of the United States. And California is the most extreme in the variation from year to year. Rivers do not flow in averages, but in extremes. An example of the extremes we're now facing is this year in Sacramento, where I live, we had a record 222 days without measurable precipitation. That was broken about a week ago when we got 1/100 of an inch of rain in a storm. Now in the current storm, we have received a new record, 5.5 inches in 24 hours. So we have a flooding in the middle of a drought. That 5.5 inches, more like 10 or 15 in the mountains, is not nearly enough to get us out of the drought. What is happening, next slide please, is that the precipitation levels in each of the droughts are not unprecedented. But what we're seeing with each successive drought is the temperatures are higher. And when temperatures are higher, then the vegetation, the natural vegetation takes up more water, the crops need more water, some of the snow and evaporates without ever reaching the rivers, so that the amount of water actually available for diversion for use or for environmental uses is less with each drought because it's hotter. The next slide shows just how extreme the droughts are, where much of California and the Colorado River Basin is in more than extreme drought. It's listed as exceptional drought. And I think we can finish the slides now. What I said that climate change is exacerbating basically our failure to adequately deal with previous droughts, and now they're getting worse. There are at least 4 problems, deficiencies in how we've been dealing with the system. First of all, we have a water right system that's intended to set priorities to determine who gets water when it's insufficient. But we've never fully applied it. We've applied it to some of the most junior water rights, but in droughts, even just severe droughts, let alone extreme or exceptional, we haven't applied it to those who claim the most senior rights. We haven't sorted out what those rights really are. We haven't actually applied the water rights system. Also, we have pretty good laws as a foundation to protect water for the environment, but it's only been applied sparingly in a few areas. In most of the state, the fish basically get what's left over after agricultural and municipal and industrial diversions take what they need. And there's, of course, a lot left over in flood years, but in the driest years, the other diversions are making use of every drop, so that the greatest loss of water during drought is to the environmental uses. They are the ones hardest hit in the drought, and we haven't proceeded adequately to address those needs. The third problem is we haven't managed our groundwater. What areas have done, both municipal and irrigation uses, in response to water short years when they are cut off, they're curtailed, or there simply isn't any water in the river for them to divert, is they switch to groundwater. The problem is the amount diverted in dry years isn't made up in wetter years. We have overdrafted to an average of about 1 million acre feet a year, an acre foot being about 326,000 gallons. In fact, in areas with clay soils, the withdrawal of groundwater causes the compaction of the soil, and the decline in the levels of the earth in the San Joaquin Valley is the greatest change in the Earth's surface in the world in the history of the human race. That there have been declines of 9 meters and more in some areas from groundwater overdraft. The fourth thing we haven't dealt with is the needs for disadvantaged communities. especially in some of our rural areas. Basically, racial segregation prevented some of the farm workers from living in the cities. They established their own communities and their own systems. The problems are that they've been relatively small areas that don't have the economies of scale to provide water supply that you do in the larger systems. And they don't have the ratepayer base to have a good system. And they are often the hardest hit in the drought, because in the groundwater levels go down as everybody switches to groundwater. The big agricultural pumps can sink deeper and get new wells, and the shallower wells for the disadvantaged small communities lose their water supply. There are also water contamination issues as the deeper wells pull contaminated groundwater from near surface layers into the area. And also compaction actually can cause increases in arsenic. So you get an increased pollution as well as reduced supply. What we have done in response to the drought includes emergency orders to actually implement the water rights systems or curtailments, exceptions allowing diversions for public health and safety. In some cases, emergency protection for flows for fish, but also in some cases, relaxing environmental flows, because sometimes there are competing needs for different environmental standards for the same water, and we have to relax one to meet the other. In the long term, we've got to address these problems, not just through emergency response, but through fundamental change in how we operate the system. Ironically, our evaluation of the previous drought is we need to be more proactive. But by the time the report was out, it was way too late to be proactive. We were reactive to the next drought. We have, in fact, enacted groundwater management legislation, but that was not until 2014. There's a 20-year period to implement the plans. We don't yet know whether the plans are adequate. They're just now due. That response will require curtailment of pumping, and fairly substantial agricultural acreage will have to be taken out of production to meet the groundwater requirements. We need to start setting environmental flows, so we're not just reactive in that area. And we've enacted a program to deal with the needs of disadvantaged communities. Grant funds for capital have been available all along, but the smaller communities lack the technical ability to access it. And we now finally have a fund for operation and maintenance. In the meantime, some of our response is emergency water supply, but we're also working on providing assistance to the disadvantaged communities. Some of them can be resolved by consolidation with the nearby larger water systems, maybe a third or more, but others are too isolated, and we need other things, including funding sources and means of providing through administrators or receivers the necessary technical, financial, and managerial support.
Thanks so much, Andy. That was also so. I hope we pick up on some of these things as to what can be done going forward. Kelsey, if I may please turn to you. As we know, 30 tribes in the US West rely on the Colorado's dwindling waters also. And there have been massive historical iniquities to do with indigenous peoples and how they continue to suffer, right? That is only getting exacerbated by the current drought. We've all seen the COVID-19 messages, wash your hands, and there have been alarming stories, for instance, when there is no piped water, then how do sort of native populations have access to running tap water? So there's public health messaging, there's all kinds of issues. But I really wanted to pick up on what you have collaborated with colleagues on, and you've written very potently about indigenous water justice. So in light of this conversation so far, could you maybe sort of help us understand what is it that you and your colleagues are working on and what do you want us to be aware of?
Sure. Thank you so much to ClassACT for having us, and to my co-panelists. I feel like we're in such good company this evening to talk about the water. So I think when we start this conversation, when we think about the birth of a nation, think about the birth of the United States, there is a legacy of colonialism and systemic racism that we have all been reckoning with in the past few years through the social justice movements that you may have been a part of or have been woken up to. Oftentimes, we focus on the land-based origins of that racism, of that colonialism, but it also is embedded in the fabric of our interactions with water itself. And that really is the foundation of many of the inequities that we see across the United States today, across North America, and across our planet. There are two wonderful scholars, Zoe Todd and Heather Davies, I believe, or Davis, that wrote a paper dating this new sort of epoch that we are in, this geologic age where humans have had the most impact on our planet and on planetary health that we now call the Anthropocene. They've dated that to the start of the Atlantic slave trade, the start of the colonization of the New World. There is a synergy that cannot be ignored with the advent of that violence towards humanity also being reaped in violence towards the planet. And we have to reconcile with that to be able to move forward, to be able to have international climate agreements that actually address the elephant in the room, which is the level of inequity that is still present. And that's what we deal with in the context of Indigenous peoples in the United States and more broadly across North America. There are massive amounts of Americans who do not have access to clean water, whether they be in First Nations, tribal nation, reservations or territories, or whether it's Flint, Michigan, or other cities around around the country, who also, we went through a period of going through a pandemic where the first line of defense against COVID-19 was to wash your hands, as you mentioned earlier. And we had water shutoffs occurring where cities and municipalities were turning people's water off so that they couldn't have access to that first frontline defense. So we had grassroots movements popping up around the United States over the course of the pandemic, initiating these movements of moratoriums for water shutoffs. And so when we think about what is water justice, it means that that there should not be pockets of Americans who bear a disproportionate burden of water inequity while you get to go enjoy a well-manicured and watered golf course in Vegas. These are the things that we have to address if we're really going to tackle this climate crisis. And so when we think about water justice, it is about the procedural, the distributive, and the recognitional or participatory aspects that humans engage in water protection and water decision-making. But we also, in the context of Indigenous water justice, if we bring in Indigenous legal systems, have to consider the inherent rights of the water itself as a living entity. And so Indigenous water justice brings in a fourth pillar of justice, which says relationality. What do we need to do for the water itself to exist, thrive, flourish, and naturally evolve? So as we take this conversation forward in the time that we have remaining, there are two aspects. There is a need for the recognition within the United States of a human right to water. There is a General Assembly resolution that many countries have endorsed, the United States has not, that recognizes an international human right to water. We need to get to that stage. And additionally, the second item that we need to do is we need to recognize globally that the water itself is a living entity and has rights therein to be protected. And I have a TED Talk that's shared in the chat now that talks a little bit more about what that might look like in practice. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for the question.
Kelsey, thanks so much. And again, there is so much there that we'll sort of, we'll do like a round of questions and I'll ask you to sort of speak a little bit more on this. if I may, Jeff, if I may just sort of turn to you again, and what we'll do is we'll sort of go in the same order, just because there's only, we are sort of lesser panelists, but we'll come back and hope that everybody has a lot of time to engage. Jeff, I wanted to just pick up something that Kelsey also referred to, which is this idea of, who pays and what is it that we need for like a global climate pact. But specifically what I wanted to sort of put to you is that Mike Carney, who's the ex-governor of this, the Central Bank of England, very prominent, he was recently speaking at the Columbia Climate School, and that's like the first, they're very proud of themselves that they have the first climate school in the country. And so let's give a shout out to what they're trying to do, that the world will need between 80 and 90 trillion, that's like trillion with a T, of private climate finance over the next 30 years to get us to anything close to net zero by 2050, which is, not that far away. And I hope that many of us, live to see this, but that's a huge amount. And given the political sort of roilings around the infrastructure bill that is just domestic to the US, I mean, could you please tell us a little bit about what do you estimate the private sector, I mean, is it ready? Is it realizing anywhere near what we need to do?
That's a wonderful question to ask. It's sort of the, I guess, trillions of dollars question. The one thing I want to say is on that question is I used to always use this when people would talk about investment, particularly in protection and investment in communities around climate, is what's the cost if we don't act, right? It's always the flip side, right? It's 80 to 90 trillion, but the cost if we don't act, if you can actually calculate human suffering and everything else, which I have lots of issues with economists trying to calculate that, it is incalculable, the cost on the flip side. So to me, it's negligible, the amount, because of the other side of the cost of loss. But I think the private sector, without an inordinate amount of regulation, really acts off of incentive. And so what's the incentive? What's pushing, or what can push the private sector to act? On one side, particularly on the finance side, and the investment side, particularly investment in real property and that sort of thing, which is some of what we were talking about, is insurance. And insurance is starting to lead the way in transforming investment. I think risk is being taken into account much more than it has in the past, and I think it has accelerated over the past few years. I think that I've seen advancements also in the democratization of data. A lot of big data has been held by large corporations or big reinsurers like Swiss Re and Munich Re and others. And a lot of that type of data and those types of analytics have started to make its way to the ground for smaller scale actors to start to participate. But that type of data is also what's driving organizations like Moody's to rethink the way it rates, it does its bond ratings, and has started, as of a couple of years ago, integrating climate into its rating system. I think that's also something very important that has an ability and has already started to push both the private, the public, and institutional sectors particularly on bond rating side. Public companies and institutions are having to react to their shareholders and sort of leaders and employees around ESG goals, and really starting to think about how they need to move the way they invest or the way they work or the types of products that they are developing in a way that I think also adds up to being transformative. But I think we're still at the very beginning of that process, and I'm very hopeful that it will continue. Companies like Ford have done a tremendous job over the past few years in transforming their ability to create electric vehicles in a way that I don't think many people have actually thought was possible. I mean, they're really pushing it. but we're still at the very beginning of this process, and I'm very skeptical that we'll get there quickly. But I am optimistic in what I have seen thus far, although I don't think that the action collectively between the private sector, the public sector, and institutional actors is going fast enough to catch up with the effects that we're already starting to see, and a lot of the issues that we're seeing with human suffering because of it. So, I mean, that's another, I guess, to the end call to action of how do we push that forward. A lot of this, advise business or work at companies or corporations that can act. And I think that's what it's going to take. So optimistic because I'm seeing change, pessimistic because of where we are right now and all that needs to happen immediately. It's sort of a tension of what we see today versus how fast we're acting.
Thanks. That the announcement today from the Securities and Exchange Commission that they are considering now including climate sort of in terms of their filings, right? And as you're saying, maybe that's optimistic and pessimistic that, wow, like they've seemed to have like realized that this is important, but they're only considering this. So I don't know, maybe people need to write the SEC commissioners, okay, and work on that. Andy, if I could turn to you, because as we know, one of the things that we've all seen in the West, I mean, even as far away as New York City, it had the worst air quality in the world for several days running over this summer because of the wildfires out West. So hopefully everyone will realize that there are massive health impacts, but these things take time to manifest. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the impact of those wildfires on drinking water quality and what that means and whether that's urban or rural. And I know that, as you said yesterday and today, there's massive rainfall in places where there has been, massive burns. And that is producing huge flood risks and sort of its own trauma on communities that have been burnt out. So if you could sort of fold all of that in, please.
Thank you. Yes, wildfire is another area where climate change is exacerbating problems that we were not adequately dealing with, even absent climate change. 2020 and 2021 have seen record acreages burned in California, 3.4 million acres in 2020 alone. And this is due to, the problems are due to long-range mismanagement in this state. A big problem has been fire suppression. Pre-European settlement, our Sierra Nevada forests used to burn on a cycle of every 15 years or so. Most of that was fairly low intensity burns that cleared out the underbrush, but did not attack the large fire-resistant trees. And the forest consisted of very old, large trees and was largely open. But with fire suppression, we now have thick underbrush and what are sometimes called ladder fuels and white firs that when there is a fire, it provides burns with higher heat and reaches the crowns and takes out the fire-resistant trees that would have survived the fire cycle we saw before European settlement. Historic logging practices have also been a big problem because they've taken out all the trees and what's grown back has been thick and without the old fire-resistant trees. Of course, that's not all wildfires are forest fires. In California, we have grasslands and oak woodland and especially chaparral, where the fire cycle is very different and fire suppression and of course historic logging have not been problems. The problem has been urban encroachment. What the chaparral fire cycle is every 30 to 70 years, and it's hot. They don't have the low intensity fires. The problem is we've moved into the high fire areas where before the fires weren't a problem because there was no housing there. Now you have both in the forests and in the chaparral areas, human encroachment, which causes more fires. But then when the fires burn and they reach the houses, they burn hotter. All the petroleum-based products, propane tanks, etc., basically explode the houses are more a danger to the forest than vice versa. And we've seen this where low intensive fires have reached the housing and exploded into high intensive fires. That also affects the air quality because you have all the contaminants caused by the petroleum fire. So what we're now seeing with the flooding after a fire are a couple of things. One, with these very high intensity fires, which was much larger areas and very high intensities than we've seen before, sometimes form what are called hydrophytic soils, where there's a wax layer and the water just runs off them and you get mud flows into the streams that can affect the water supplies. And we're seeing with these hotter fires that wax layer is deeper in the soil, 4 inches instead of 1 inch, so more soil is sloughing in, and that can require additional treatment or even switching to alternative supplies for it while you wait for the water to clear up. We're also seeing with these high intensity fires that in some rural areas, this happened in the Camp Fire, the systems lost pressure and they sucked in all that volatile organic compounds from the air, and you have very high levels of chemicals like benzene in the water, so that you've sometimes had to completely replace the system to deal with the contamination, basically with the bad air sucked into the systems. We're working on emergency response. Sometimes you have to replace infrastructure. The question, if there's time, is the tribal interests of the tribes have not been affected as much. That's not for a good reason. It's because they've lost their land, and many of them don't have water systems to replace. But part of the answer is indigenous knowledge. We're starting finally to respect what the tribes know about managing the forest and prescribed burns.
Thank you, Andy. And I guess it's, you learn, this is like a hard lesson, right? And what Kelsey was telling us, that it's really at the moment of that your colonization that these changes start to, play out. And as we're now realizing, great harm has happened. Kelsey, if I could just turn to you, and this is slightly a little more global. So it's not, only sort of limited to tribal nations or First Nations. I wanted you to talk about a little bit, because I really want everybody to watch your amazing TED Talk, which I think is really a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I hope people take the time to watch. This sort of these global crises that are getting caused by sea level rise and where and how people can live and where they'll have to move is playing out around the world. I mean, this summer, half of Bangladesh was underwater. And so this goes back to Jeff's earlier, right? Like the impact on actual lives. I mean, do we have a sense of what that actually means? Major cities are underwater. And what does that do to sort of political dynamics within countries as well as across borders? Because again, we saw the politics a couple of years ago, but how much are people really moving because of climatic conditions and long-term droughts?
Thank you for that question. I think before I move into that, I wanted to pick up on what some of the co-panelists have said. Jeff started us off talking about cultural transformations, really rethinking our cultural values, living with water, that hopefully then can lead to behavior change. And I want to touch on something, that Andy said as well, in the context of fire being so interconnected to water and being able to lean into indigenous knowledge. To do that, you have to say, do what Jeff said earlier, which is to transform our cultural values so that we value indigenous knowledge, which through colonialism has been suppressed and targeted violently to be eradicated in many different forms. And then once you reconcile with that past and actually start to value that knowledge system that despite all attempts to eradicate it still exists and is still here, then you have to change your behavior and actually operationalize, as Jeff said earlier, the laws and policies that enable that knowledge and science to thrive. And unfortunately, that's not happening in California it's moving better, but still not happening in California, and also is limiting the prospects that we have globally in the context of sea level rise. And I'll just give you one example. In the past 2 years, we've had a lot of, again, as I mentioned earlier, the social reckoning with social justice. We have a lot of Karens in the world that like to call the police on people of color who are in forests or by the sea, trying to enact that traditional knowledge, that indigenous knowledge, trying to protect and restore that connection they have with nature. Because for some reason, and it's not for some reason, we've been conditioned through the environmental conservation history of the United States and people like John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt to only view nature. It is to be something that is just there for our viewing consumption, not to actually be in relation with and to have a responsibility to. And so when we come back to what Jeff said earlier, that's the behavior change that we have to start to see. And we're just not there yet. And that actually plays into your question around sea level rise. So we are currently seeing sea level rise, and sea level rise has occurred on our planet for millennia, but it's happening at an increasing frequency than it's ever happened before. And what we also are seeing is, as Jeff noted, a history of infrastructure that is not adaptive to sea level rise because it was constructed under a cultural value system that viewed water as a hazard. It wasn't constructed in a way of, I want to live with water. I want to be in relation with water. No, it was, I'm going to suppress water. I'm going to violently make water retreat from anything around me or near me. And so when we think about what do these rising seas mean for communities? Well, they're coming, they're already here. We have frontline communities from Louisiana to Long Island, where I'm from, that are already facing erosion, storm surge, impacts on groundwater through saltwater intrusion because of rising seas. What we're trying to have addressed at the global level is hopefully for it not to be the worst case scenario of sea level rise, which is 9 feet, complete inundation, which then leads to massive amounts of climate migration from the coastline, likely to the interior or to other parts of the world, where we don't even have enough infrastructure to support water systems in those areas. So, rural communities that are still on well systems, et cetera. So, it really comes, Jeff said it so beautifully at the start. We really have to start thinking about what our water future looks like. And I guess that's a part of this talk. What is that vision look like, and how do we make sure that that vision is inclusive and doesn't reproduce water colonialism for future generations?
Thank you, Kelsey. That's it's rallying, right? It feels like you're absolutely right, and you're just putting so many things together. If I could just, because this is just from Bill Mumore, who again, was unable to join us today. He wanted we were going to ask him, there's a very influential and growing influential sort of article that he's just been recently a part of. As everybody knows, there's been a growing rights of rivers movement that is around the world. New Zealand was, first in it. Then there's ideas that even to the Ganges, you give some kinds of rights. So this is a growing sort of movement. But Bill and some colleagues of his, wetland scientists, really sat down and said, well, by that accounting, wetlands also should have rights, right? So it goes back to like a whole rights-based framework that's been circulating. They have been working with the Sarayaku people in the Ecuadorian Amazonian rainforest. And I asked him to reflect on this a little bit, and he has some very interesting things that, Andy, especially, this is something you even said, so I think it'll sort of resonate, and how, Kelsey, when you were saying, these ideas have to get sort of, we have to imbibe them and imbue them and learn from this, right? So these are just the reflections that Bill has said, and they meet regularly. I mean, and they connect over Zoom, it seems, but these are their conversations thus far comparing. So this is just some reflections from Bill. He's saying that, look, we consider wetlands and forests as natural resources to be exploited or as barriers to be removed, whereas they consider natural systems as living beings. They see it as a living forest and living lagoons or water. So there's a totally different conception starting out. Then he says that we think of nature as an economic commodity or a cost to development that, that meets our needs, right? But they see themselves as being living parts of a living nature. So it's a very different conception. He thinks we divide natural systems intellectually by disciplines, whereas they think of it as like a single living being. He thinks that we exclude to a large extent moral judgments and values from our science. That's, really implicates our whole systems of knowing, right? And he says that they approach it completely differently, where it is amalgamated within. And it's very much a part of how you relate. And this is his last sort of reflection, that he thinks that we have, and this may really get to, Jeff, some of your sustainability, right? Like, where have we historically and how have we grown the human population at the cost of other populations and other ecosystems? We have used our power over nature to grow a population that may be exceeding the capacity of natural systems to continue functioning, whereas their population remains at a level that is sustained by the forested wetlands that they inhabit. And those are very different conceptions. So I just wanted to sort of share those thoughts from Bill so that we bring them, forward into our conversations and our work. But again, I know that he'd be very, happy if anybody wanted to reach out to him. So I just wanted to share that. I want to make this, we have a couple of minutes before we turn to audience Q&A, if we can do that. I believe we may have up to 10 minutes, so it should be okay. Can we get some of you guys to think about what the others are saying, just amongst yourselves, right? What stands out at you? Obviously, some of what stood out at me, I've sort of already shared, but where do you think we are, and how do you think we sort of move some of these conversations forward? So if any one of you would like to jump in by something that anybody else said, or, please let's take this time to engage.
I'd just like to offer something to pick up on what Kelsey was saying before, that I think is really, really important. And I was an adjunct professor at the Tulane School of Architecture when I lived in New Orleans, when I was back there. And I would teach a class, and one of the things that I would have the students think about and reflect on, because you actually do have these writings available, is how did sort of the people who inhabited the land before the French colonized, what then became New Orleans, how did they live with the land? And what you start to find, and I'm saying this to say, to understand the way people lived on the land before with a certain amount of risk, I think is really important for us to think about and sort of come back to. So, people lived on those lands for a very long time. Flooding is not new. Flooding has happened. Of course, it's been exacerbated, but it's not new. But people lived in certain places. And of course, there was also sort of a bit of movement around the area, but there was an understanding of the natural systems and living with the natural systems that allowed people to live on the land for thousands of years before, and you could say this about places like Mexico City and other places, before it was engineered, and engineering going back to the, late 17th century. And, if you actually just go back, and there's a great, amazing geographers at universities across the country who have done this work, particularly on cities and looking where settlements are versus where natural systems were, and how do you start to uncover that? And there's also a layer of how Native people lived on the land that corresponds to that. And just starting to understand that and learn how people lived previously, although we're in a very different time and we've done terrible things to the land, I think can start to go back to uncover how a pathway forward, right? So one of the things that an amazing geographer did after Hurricane Ida recently is start to unearth the streams that actually were in place in Queens, here in New York, in the areas that flooded. No one knew that that was originally a stream in the areas that flooded, right? You have to go back and start to uncover these places. And I think that gives us a pathway forward. There's all sorts of, legal issues and property ownership issues and other things that relate to that. But I think really understanding where we live and the systems as they existed prior to sort of the colonization of the land, I think is very important to sort of point out a future for us. Even if that future is going to be slightly engineered or a bit different, we still have to understand where we've come from. And I think that's really, really important.
I love that idea of unearthing our streams. And we know for a fact that with development trends around the world, originally I happen to come from Pakistan, but one of the things that's been happening is that more and more farmland is being turned over to housing. And we know that once farmland is gone, it's very hard to recover back. And so what does that mean for ways of life? And where do we keep spreading onto? So absolutely. Andy, if I could just ask you maybe to pick up on one thing that I think has sort of come up in parts of these discussions, right? But you only alluded to so much of our food for this country, fresh produce, we're moving into the colder weather, is basically, grown in California. I mean, apparently 80% of the world's almond supply is grown in California, right? I have been in Karachi in Pakistan and people have said to me, buy these almonds from California. They're wonderful. So we're like growing almonds in California and we're shipping them 10,000 miles away. I mean, this is unbelievable to me, but it is the case. So what do you do with the food production system that we have currently with what is developing?
One of the problems is what we have done. We have made ourselves done what is sometimes referred to as hardening of demand, because previously the way you handled droughts is you didn't plant that year. But now we've switched to the more economically productive tree and vine crops that need water every year. So with water being short, we've shifted to more efficient crops, but we've hardened demand so that we're less able to adapt to the wide variation between wet and dry years. With the enactment of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014, we are seeing that some of these areas are actually going to have to be taken out of production. We actually had areas where I said people switched to groundwater during dry years. We had some areas converted from rangeland to tree crops relying solely on groundwater. And that greatly exacerbated the problem of people losing their domestic wells with pumping, bringing groundwater way down in the last drought. So we are going to have to move back to adjust to live within our means. It's much like what's been talked about in flood control or flood adaptation. The maps of the archaeological sites here in the Central Valley are not publicly released to avoid people stealing from archaeological sites. But my understanding is pretty clear that the archaeological sites are where it doesn't flood. We've constrained our rivers. Our system isn't adequate to deal with historic floods, let alone the exacerbated conditions we have with climate change. So we have to make some major changes we haven't even caught up with the pre-climate baseline, and we're going to have to make more adjustments, which will mean we'll have to take some land out of production. But with efficiencies, at least economically, we'll be doing as well with moving towards the higher value crops.
Thanks very much also for really flagging the impacts on groundwater, because obviously that's what's happened, right? We know places like Saudi Arabia is basically under aquifers, which are closed, are essentially gone, and they ran through them in about 30 years because somebody decided that they were going to grow rice in the desert. And now, there's no more groundwater there. So this really does happen, and especially where there's no recharge. Kelsey, there's a lot of interest in trying to maybe understand some of these historical deprivations that have happened with native waters, right? And that's part of the work that you've done with colleagues. I know you work with Dan McCool, who's really wonderful. His Native Waters, I really recommend to everyone also to see, you know, the history of how the US has dealt. And this is, again, just sort of US specific, US Southwest specific. Could you maybe just like help people understand a little bit about what that sort of, I suppose, that, you know, injustice has looked like?
Oh, I think we're going to need a whole series just on that. What does that injustice look like? I'll give you one example for, it's not necessarily US specific, but it could be replicated in any other community, whether it be the US or other parts of the community, global community. But I'll reference one, which is Neshkantaga First Nation. It's a First Nation in Northern Ontario. It's a fly-in community. If you were born in 1995, you've never been able to turn on your tap and have a glass of clean drinking water. So I'll let that sit with you in the sense that there is a whole generation of Indigenous young people that have never been able to have that privilege, you know, to have that human dignity. And I think sometimes that is overlooked very much in the Western world. You know, another aspect is I was at a Native youth conference on water a few years back, and we were just kind of talking, you know, about our experiences, and we all said, you know, oh, is the water safe to drink? There were some non-Indigenous people in the room with us, and they were like, why did you ask that? We were all like, we ask that anywhere we go because the water is never safe to drink where we live. And that was common amongst all of us as Indigenous young people at that time. Still was kind of young at that time. And so that was, you know, Maori youth from Aotearoa, New Zealand. That was Aboriginal youth from Australia. That was First Nations youth from Canada, Indigenous Native American youth from the US. We had that, unfortunately, that shared experience of being denied human dignity for lack of access to clean water. And that's just touching the surface of the iceberg of water inequity present for Indigenous peoples around the world.
Kelsey, I love that, and I find it so moving and so painful, and I hope that, you know, everybody listening and watching has a similar feeling. And what really resonated with me is what you said. It's interesting. So poorer or less developed parts of the world and populations, even within cities where, you know, some people have big pools and have the exact same experience. You always ask, is the water safe to drink? That is like never a working assumption that you start from. You do not turn on your tap and start drinking. And if you can afford bottled water, you know, that's good for you, but you just don't assume. So when I start encountering people who just like that's like their worldview, and I think, really, do you have like any idea how the rest of the world lives or what their reality is? Like, you know, is that how disconnected you are? So, yeah.
And these inequities, they manifest across scales and across geographies. You know, we talked a little bit about groundwater. Another First Nation close to where I'm zooming in from today, Six Nations of the Grand River, has been on intermittent boiled water advisories, which means that they've lasted less than 12 months. They're not listed as long-term, but they still are bad, for, you know, more than 3 decades, and not everyone has access to clean water. But Nestle has been siphoning off their groundwater to fill bottled water for Southern Ontario residents that want to buy it from water that is seeded within their treaty lands called the Haldeman Tract. And so young people have been fighting against one of the biggest corporations on the planet to protect their water that they can't even get access to within their home reserve. But Nestle can siphon it off for less than a penny a liter. So these are the inequities that start to just pile on and compound and make it really, really difficult for there to be a level playing field when we talk about water justice globally.
And just to pick up on the other end of that, I've actually sort of been in some of these bottling water company plants, And they're very proud when they show you their, their manufacturing lines, right? And they're like, look, we can produce 10,000 bottles an hour, like, those half a liter ones. And you're having like this nightmare question of, well, what's happening to all of the plastic that is getting produced, right? I mean, I understand that's like a whole different thing to do with like what Andy was talking about, like in terms of pollution and seeping into groundwater. And
it's all connected. And that's the thing, is we've spent centuries, and we, sort of the collective of the Western ideology, have spent centuries shaping water as a barrier, as a hazard, rather than as a connector, as a life giver, as a life support system for this planet. And because of that cultural valuing, we have allowed for its destruction, its degradation, and the production of harmful entities and things that would see its further destruction.
I'd like to weigh in briefly on the issue of bottled water. When we set drinking water standards, we often get opposition from the chemical companies that polluted the groundwater, because they're afraid that, well, they know that if we set standards, then some of the cities will sue them to make them clean up the groundwater they polluted, to reduce the city's cost of compliance with the new water quality standards. And these chemical companies raise the issue of affordability. We can't set strict drinking water standards because it'll make the water cost more. And then we have the environmental justice community come in and say, well, you think treating the water is expensive. What about the bottled water we have to drink because our water is contaminated? I would add that if you are in the 98% of this country that has safe tap water, there is no good reason to drink bottled water. Here in California, at least, and I think it's true nationwide, it's not tested as frequently. It's not tested for as many chemicals. There's not sufficient response to contamination. And all bottled water in plastic bottles with plastic caps is contaminated with microplastics. So some people have to drink bottled water because their supply is unsafe, but the rest of us shouldn't touch the stuff, even aside from the issue of what do you do about all the plastic?
And that compounded inequity comes back in, where you have a community that's been on a boil water advisory for 26 years. All they've drank is bottled water, or water piped in, or water on a tanker that likely is contaminated through microplastics for a generation, because they haven't had a water system that's been put in that actually supplies adequate infrastructure. So the cycle, and this is where we talk about water colonialism and water injustice being systemic. It's not something that just kind of was a one-off and, oh, you had to boil your water for a few weeks. No, this is generations compounded. And so it also leads to historical trauma in the sector, in the water sector, for communities around the world.
Could I just add one last really quick thing that brings a circle together of all the things we've been talking about, which is the case of Heineken in Jakarta, and using the groundwater for the brewery purposes in Jakarta, which of course exacerbates subsidence in a mega city that is highly susceptible to storm surge due to climate, already, and only exacerbated during the climate change. So it's sort of a double whammy of not just the extraction of the groundwater for sort of production purposes by Heineken, and by the way, Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands, but that then causing the subsidence is going to have, is already and will have further dramatic impacts on the millions and millions of people who live in Jakarta, in the greater Jakarta area in Indonesia, and sort of the turning that around and trying to figure out a different way. But these things just continue to go unless you catch it and you abate it. And we just see it more and more around the world, and particularly in the developing world, which scares me the most.
Yes, I think that's such a great point, because one of the things we know is some of these cities, like Jakarta specifically, right? It's already 40% of it is under current sea level. So as you're saying, if there is further groundwater subsidence, I mean, Andy gave us massively scary figures, but it's true, this happens, right? There is compaction. And so if that's the case, imagine what happens and, to millions and millions and millions about this inequity that as Kelsey is trying to tell us is all linked and historically contingent. It didn't just sort of come out of nowhere and, oh, it's fine, today I can boil my water. But really, why do I have to boil it? You really have to sort of dive deep. So there's a very rich discussion going on in chat, in Q&A, but I really want to be mindful of everybody's time. And so I thank you all immensely for your time, your knowledge, your work on this, your care of this. And I have already offered you to everyone here on this call as resources who will be available. So if we didn't get to things, I hope that, people reach out to you and that we really keep this conversation going. So what I will do is I will hand off now to our wonderful host, Marion, for the calls to action.
Thank you, Aram. We are very sorry that we weren't able to get to your questions this evening. As you could tell, there's so much rich conversation and there's so much more to talk about. But what we do want to do is give our panelists an opportunity to suggest things that we as individuals or that ClassACT, which is an activist organization, can do to try to create some positive change in this direction. So I am going to ask Kelsey if you could give us a call to action that would be helpful to us, and then we'll go through with the others.
Sure. I think my call to action is to find a way to connect to water, not to view water as a resource for your consumption or to consider it in the context of what types of benefits it provides to you, but to find a way to build a connection to water where you actually give back to it. And that's going to look different in so many different ways for each of you, depending on what part of the world you're in, what your passions are. But oftentimes what I tell my students is the first place to start is, one, identify the water body closest to you. That could be a well in your backyard. It could be a river down the road. And go and have a visit with the water. Maybe it's even, if you're in Southern Ontario like me, the massive precipitation, or like Jeff, the weather bombs that you are getting from the atmospheric rivers. Sitting with that water and just having an opportunity to visit with the water and build that connection. Sometimes we do not take enough. There's some really great research around forest bathing. I almost kind of want you to have a water bath in nature. Visit with the water and find a way to then give back. We spend so much time going to water bodies that are pristine, beautiful beaches, but so many parts of water around the world are threatened. And when you go and visit those threatened places as well, you feel what the water is feeling. You feel that negative energy, you feel all of that. And hopefully it will inspire you to act in whatever capacity you can locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andy.
I'm going to speak briefly to something I didn't speak to earlier, is the need for investment in our drinking water infrastructure and the need for fair rates. I was at a conference recently when they talked about how do they hold down rates, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And it's basically by deferring maintenance and deferring necessary infrastructure. And we've got to fix that. We've got to put more money into infrastructure, and we've got to resist efforts like we now have in California to try to tie the rates to the cost of service in a way that means that you can't have rates that help the lower income people provide adequate drinking water, because the rates have to be tied to the cost of service. So recognize we need fair rate structures and we need more investment in safe drinking water.
Thank you. Jeff.
First of all, both of what my co-panelists said needs to move forward. I would say a call to action to focus activism on moving the conversation forward to action. And giving action and direct action and immediate action as much play as policy and politics and the science of politics as we're talking about climate. We have gotten lost in the past 2 decades on debating the science. And we have not had a parallel track of providing direct action, resources, finance, and infrastructure to mitigate and to help sustain our livelihoods in the places where we live. In all the ways that we discussed today, we should be doing that. And I think now is the pivot point to move that forward. And sort of the activism to our elected officials and everyone else around thinking about how we should do this in the ways that Kelsey and Andy explained, and then doing it and not sitting on it for a decade, I think is most important to the survival of most of where we live.
Thank you. And Aram.
I want to just share a story that picks up on what Kelsey said, because I hope that that can be everybody's call to actions. Kelsey, this was about a decade ago when I had my own water connection. And I promise you that I have since spent the last decade sort of obsessing about it. My husband makes fun of me that I have water on my brain. I'm not sure that's a compliment, but I am obsessed. I felt I was standing at the Indus River Delta before it gets to the Arabian Sea, and there's a massive barrage across it that was made by the British, as you can imagine, when they ruled a united India. And I looked left, so I'm sort of looking onto where the river is and at the barrage, and it was this beautiful flowing thing. And then you look on the right and the delta was completely dry. This was in high summer season. And very poor marginal fishermen, sort of, their livelihoods were in that delta. And now we've dried it out because of all the water diversions, right? Going on for about a century. So I cannot impress more on people the importance of having some kind of connection. I will say it's very, maybe it's embarrassing, but now I think I'm like in a phase of life, I actually felt claimed by the river. I felt claimed by the water, and it is a spiritual connection, and I now feel it, and it's a part of who I am. So I hope people begin to feel where we are and go make their own personal stories and connections.
Thank you all so much. This has been an extraordinary conversation and very, very rich. I want to assure everybody who is watching this evening that we are keeping the chat and the questions, and we will make sure that those are accessible on our website, as well as there are going to be videos of this. There'll be a great big large video and then individual videos. And we hope that you will share this information with others that you know might be interested in it. I also want to share, before we leave, ClassACT's call to action. And ClassACT's call to action is that we are seeking a new project focused on the environment and climate change. And certainly after this conversation, I hope it will be focused on water in specific. We invite all of you who are listening to help us find that project and to work to create it. If you're interested in joining us in this work, please contact us as soon as possible at classacthr73@gmail.com. Finally, I want to say thank you to Aram, Kelsey, Bill, who we appreciate that he sent in the information if he couldn't be with us tonight, and Andy and Jeff. We have all learned so much. Our thanks also go to our production and program teams for this evening: Jackie Swearingen, Nancy Sarman, Ann McKinnon, Sharon Tischer, Rick Weil, Rick Brotman, Katie Marinello, Kate Freed, and Diana Labantu. Thanks to our moderator and to our panelists and to all of you who were here with us this evening. Good evening.